And joining us now, we have the president of the National Taxpayers Union, Pete Sepp. And I'm just going to start, Pete, number one, by saying welcome to the show. But number two, what would taxpayers possibly be upset about that they would need to unionize over? They're all happy, right? Everything's going great.
Taxpayers of the nation and the world need to unite. And that's what we're all about, bringing people together over the common questions of how do we pay government's bills and how do we do it fairly, simply, and leave the rest of us alone on our economic activities.
And I think this is probably one of the, if not the most important topic we can talk about. We keep getting distracted with other things, but this affects how much money stays in your pocket. This is a huge deal, and the money that is taken out of your pocket being used in an appropriate manner, which is a big part of the problem. And I was reading some of the stuff on the lawsuit against Google, the investigation by the Department of Justice for antitrust violations, and it just seems like we have a segment of the political world that cannot stand it when somebody succeeds.
Yeah, that's true. And taxpayers need to care about this, going back to the value of government proposition, because number one, these antitrust investigations cost a whole lot of money, hundreds of millions of dollars. And it doesn't just come out of the fees and the fines that the litigated parties have to pay. It comes out of our pockets too. Another reason we have to care is that various industries, not just the tech industry and Google and all the others, but all industries contribute to government coffers. You hurt their bottom line, you hurt their shareholders, you hurt their customers, you hurt the small businesses and the supply chain. They're going to be paying less taxes, sending less revenues to the government. So it's in the government's best interest to let these companies evolve. But the third big reason is that all the innovation that comes from these companies, think about cloud data storage, think about good self-service websites where you can get questions answered. Those kinds of things get picked up in government and make government run more cheaply for taxpayers. Governments don't develop that on their own. Those are primarily private sector developments.
Well, and let me ask you this, and this is the comparison that jumped into my mind. When we talk about law enforcement, and we've had this discussion in the past, that there are some places that law enforcement runs what's called a speed trap. They set things up to make it as easy as possible to catch somebody and take their money, take their time, take their license in some case. To me, in some ways, we're starting to use the antitrust regulations instead of for their intended purpose, but as kind of a financial, economic speed trap in a way, just to go after people we don't like just so we can get some money. Is that a fair comparison, you think?
Yes, it is. And it's just as arbitrary. You know, when you think about it, and much greater minds than my own have said this more eloquently. It was actually Milton Friedman, the late great economist, and we were interviewing him a good 25 years ago when he was still alive, and he said this exact analogy. It's like the government plays traffic cop, setting you up as a successful company to go forward, go as fast as you want until we say you've gone too fast. We're not going to tell you when or where, just beware, you're going to eventually get pulled over. That kind of uncertainty not only exists in antitrust, it exists in lots of other regulations, the tax code, and it puts a damper on our ability as an economy to grow from big businesses down to small ones. When you don't know the rules of the road, or you're given the rules of the road, and then later the government says, we changed them, sorry we didn't tell you, but pay the fine anyway, that's a problem.
Well, it flies in the face of the principles of capitalism. Principles of capitalism, you let the market decide. The market decides what it likes. In the case of this Google lawsuit, they're basically suing because too many people like to use Google instead of something else by their own choice.
And the
which,
competitors to Google are upset about that.
well,
And
of
that's
course.
really, yeah, and that's not the purpose of antitrust. For the better part of 40 years, we've had something in place, a legal doctrine called the Consumer Welfare Standard. That's the yardstick by which we judge a lot of antitrust cases. Are consumers being harmed? Is there deceptive advertising? Were they given a product that's not functioning right? Were they price gouged? Those kinds of questions are legitimate ones to be settled by antitrust. But when competitors like Yelp or TripAdvisor are saying, you know what, attorneys general in the states and at the federal level, we're upset that Google isn't preferencing our search results on its platform, so we need you to sue them and get them to stop it. That's an inappropriate use of antitrust. Thank goodness the judge in this case saw through that argument and tossed it out, tossed 4 of the 7 arguments that the states and the federal government were making against Google in this trial, but several others are proceeding. One of the biggest arguments, according to the government, is that Google and Apple and a couple of others have concluded agreements for Google to load its search engine on their devices preferentially, and the money that helped to conclude these agreements is somehow evidence of monopolistic conduct. Well, unfortunately, you see that kind of activity everywhere in the economy. If we want to get particular about it, it means that Kirkland brand can no longer pay to advertise in front of Costco shelves ahead of other brands. I mean, this could go all the way into every recess of our economy if the government's argument is allowed to stand.
The government is basically arguing that, again, using a metaphor with different businesses, it's arguing that McDonald's isn't doing nearly enough to help advertise and push the little mom and pop hamburger stand down on the corner, and that's wrong, so they should be penalized for it. The winners win, the non-winners don't. That's kind of the way the system is set up. And I personally don't think it's the government's job to step in and say, you're winning too hard, you're winning too much, and you've got to stop doing that. And that's the basis of this entire push by the Department of Justice, as near as I can tell from everything I've read.
Yes, it certainly looks like that. And again, I'd emphasize, you can hate Google with every breath in your body, but you still should be concerned about the government overreach in this case. The fact is, if they can do it to this company, they can do it to any company. And in fact, they're already doing it to other companies. This Federal Trade Commission and Department of Justice in the Biden administration has unleashed a new wave of very aggressive lawsuits across a number of industries, not just tech. They are arguing exotic legal theories in court that have basically set aside 40, even 50 years of doctrines that have helped give some certainty to both the government and companies about what is inbounds and out of bounds with these antitrust laws. Those are all being upended right now, and that's to the detriment of our free market economy.
You're trying to convince me that the Biden administration is just making stuff up to get their way. I just can't believe that, Pete. Come on, that's never happening. Come on, right?
My goodness, no, never. And
No.
FTC Chair Lena Khan has no ideas of her own about how to push antitrust theory to one where the government always wins and the private sector always loses.
Well, I think that this leads to an appropriate question, because it's not just this. I mean, that's kind of a headline story going on right now, the antitrust suit against Google. And usually everybody's knee-jerk reaction is, yeah, take it to the big guy. Well, no. You've got to look at the implications of what comes after that. But I do have another question, and we'll talk about some broader issues if you can stick around through the break.
Absolutely.
Have some other things we can dip into, including it's the summer of strikes. When does the National Taxpayers Union go on strike? Can we just get picket signs and go in front of the IRS building and say, we're not going to pay? I don't think it works like that, does it?
No.
Yeah, I was afraid of that. I was hoping you would correct me, but no, as it turns out, it doesn't work that way. But as taxpayers, we do have to pay attention to what's going on so that we can react appropriately and make sure our voices are heard on it. We'll continue talking to Pete Sepp, the president of the National Taxpayers Union, about exactly that when we return on Middays live in the Element Wealth Studios. Keep it is on a Thursday. Dave Hughes here. Pete Sepp with us, the president of the National Taxpayers Union. And Pete, we were talking about the antitrust case. That's not the only thing facing Americans. In a lot of cases, they don't even realize it because we don't pay attention and we don't connect the dots. I think you did a good job in the first segment of connecting the dots between why it affects the average taxpayer when the Department of Justice goes after Google because so many people like to use Google. There are direct connections between these things, and they're not very well made publicly a lot of times. And it's probably on purpose, I would think, don't you think?
Well, I'm afraid so. There are many actions the government takes in the tax and regulation sphere every day that you don't read about because some member of Congress isn't giving a speech about it, and yet it has huge implications. When you think, for example, the Internal Revenue Service got an $80 billion with a B dollar funding boost in that Inflation Reduction Act that passed Congress in 2022. There was very little fanfare about that. In fact, there are only 3 paragraphs in the entire several hundred page bill that even talk about the IRS funding. Basically, Congress said to the Internal Revenue Service, here's $80 billion, spend about $46 billion of it on enforcement, a few billion on taxpayer services, a few billion on your business systems, the rest on support services. Now go do what you want with it. And that is a shocking abdication of responsibility on the part of Congress, and it shows now with the IRS. In fact, we have a project of consisting of a whole advisory board, former IRS officials, academics, politicians even, trying to get the funding to where it's needed most as we try to whittle it down at the same time. And where it's needed most is doing things like making sure taxpayers can get someone to answer the phone at the IRS and get a good answer to their question when they finally get through to the IRS, and making sure the IRS does all of its rulemakings in public so people have a chance to comment on it. They rarely do that now. And I can attest to that. When you see a rulemaking by the IRS submitted for public comment, there are probably 4 or 5 others that never see light of day and they just get enacted on their own. Those are serious problems. You never see them happening in a congressional hearing room or on the floor of the House or Senate, but they affect millions of taxpayers.
How much of this could be solved if we just simplified the tax code? I mean, yeah, you've probably seen the same memes I have, where it's an imaginary discussion between a taxpayer and the federal government, and the government saying, okay, it's time to pay your taxes. And the person says, okay, how much? And they said, not going to tell you, but if you get it wrong, you're going to jail. You got to guess. Yeah, that's basically where we're at now.
It's very frustrating. And in fact, every year we do a study of the number of hours and the amount of money people spend just to comply with the federal income tax code. Now, we estimate more than 6 billion hours from the entire American people go into that compliance, over $300 billion in out-of-pocket, and the value of the time costs going on here. There's got to be a better way than this. In fact, there are several better ways proposed in detail over the past several years. A flat rate income tax with a very simple base, or a retail sales tax at the national level to replace the whole thing. There are plenty of good ideas, and Congress just needs to pick up the ball and run with them. We had that chance in 2017. We took a different direction. Did some simplification, helped a lot of folks with various parts of the tax code and making it more comprehensible, delivering some tax relief, but we didn't do that big overhaul that a lot of folks were expecting. It's still out there, and it would do a lot of good if we undertook it. We're pressuring Congress indeed to undertake it.
Is this the same kind of uphill battle as the discussion over term limits in a slightly different arena is? In that, are we going to be able to convince Congress to take a move that they might see as not beneficial to themselves? I hate to be that cynical about it, but let's just deal with this head on. Is that an uphill battle like it looks like it is to me?
It's an uphill battle, but possibly not as steep as term limits, only because, number one, there is a benefit to members of Congress for simplifying the tax system. Their constituents would blame them a lot less every April, for sure. I also think that a simplified tax system would work to deliver more consistent revenues and in probably larger quantity down the line than this current system does. Politicians love to spend money. I think that's a cynical reason for doing tax reform, but maybe that would work in our favor while we try to figure out how to limit spending at the same time we're limiting taxes. So I think there are a few more advantages in our favor, but as you say, though, it would take a lot of work.
Well, and one of the disadvantages is you could no longer argue incessantly over whether or not people who have accumulated more wealth need to pay a higher rate of taxes. That takes that off of the table politically. So that's going to be an immediate no vote from some people that I'm sure both you and I could run down the list of names that would be against taking that off the table. So that's a complication into the middle of all this. There are advantages and disadvantages to all the various plans. Flat tax, everybody's paying the same. National sales tax, well, that kind of gives a big incentive to keep the economy pumping along and churning, because the more that's being sold, the more taxes are being collected. I think there are a lot of different angles that could be taken to sell this. We just have to have somebody that, how do I put this? We have to find some people that are less interested in continuously squabbling in front of a camera and more interested in actually getting things done. That's my opinion. You don't have to sign off on that. I could be dragging you off into the deep water, I know, but it just feels to me like that's part of the problem here. And a lot of this stuff could be cleared up fairly simply. What do you think the chances are that we'll get some of this cleared up in say, the next 10 years?
Oh, yeah, I've been in that deep water so long, I'm growing fins. But yeah, it is something we have to do. And really, I think the decision is going to be forced on Congress and our other leaders here in Washington pretty soon, because, as I said, with a $6 billion hour, $300 billion compliance burden alone of the federal income tax system, not including state income taxes and other types of federal taxes, this system is beginning to sag under the weight of its own complexity. Pretty soon it could just collapse. And we might be looking at a situation where they have to confront doing something differently. I mean, at some point, people are going to become so confused, and their accountants will, and their tax preparers and the tax lawyers will end up throwing up their hands and saying, we don't know what this means anymore either. So at some point, there's going to be that realization, and everyone will just have to say, okay, we're going to start from scratch and design something that looks like it was done so from an intelligent life form.
Okay, you're in deeper water than I am. I love this. I like this a lot, Pete. Well, and that's the problem. We keep on trying to keep on, if you will, and we have turned the tax code specifically into a Frankenstein's monster. At this point, it's just pieces welded onto pieces, stuck onto pieces with super glue and silly putty, and sometimes just spit and baling wire. And yeah, sooner or later, you would think this entire creaky mechanism will just fall to pieces, and then we got a big problem. But how do we get any of this taken care of in terms of, the tax code changes that could happen in terms of the Google antitrust suits and other antitrust suits like those, where it's kind of being weaponized in a way. What can the average taxpayer do to affect this?
They've got to organize, and we have plenty of information on how you all can do that at the local, state, and national levels, even the international ones. And it's all available through us at NTU, our initials for National Taxpayers Union, NTU.org.
NTU.org. Go over there and you can find out more right now. I'll start working on my picket sign just in case that becomes an option, Pete. We can always hope, right?
All right.
Pete Sepp, president of the National Taxpayers Union. Enjoyed it, my friend. Keep up the good fight and keep treading water in the deep end of the pool, okay? We'll talk to you again soon.
Will do. Take care.
We continue on Middays live in the Element Wealth studios right after this.